On the night her younger sister made her debut, Lady Cecilia Harrow stood where she had learned to stand best, slightly apart, near enough to observe everything, distant enough to belong to nothing. The Harrow ballroom shimmered with borrowed splendor, crystal chandeliers ablaze with candlelight, polished floors reflecting silk skirts and gleaming boots, laughter rising and falling in rehearsed crescendos. White roses climbed the walls in extravagant arrangements, already shedding petals onto the marble, their beauty brief and ornamental, much like the young women circulating beneath them. Cecilia lingered near one such arrangement, half concealed by blooms and shadow. At 28 she was not old, not truly, but society had long ago decided she was finished. Her first season had passed quietly. The second had passed more quietly still. By the third, she had become something else entirely, reliable, sensible, the eldest daughter who remained behind to smooth mishaps and absorb disappointments so that others might shine. Across the room Julia, the youngest, radiant and breathless, was encircled by eager gentlemen vying for space on her dance card. She laughed too brightly, her cheeks flushed, eyes wide with the intoxicating knowledge that she was desired. Cecilia watched one gentleman bow so deeply Julia hid her smile behind her fan, and felt the familiar distant ache settle into her chest. Not envy precisely but remembrance. She had once stood where Julia stood now. Once, long enough ago that it felt like another lifetime. "Cece," murmured Marianne, appearing at her side in pale blue silk. "You are hiding again." "I am not hiding," Cecilia replied mildly. "I am strategically positioned." Marianne snorted softly. "You are pressed against the wall like a misplaced ornament. People will think you are part of the decor." "I should hope so," Cecilia said. "The decor at least receives appreciative glances." Marianne's expression softened. She linked her arm through Cecilia's and gave it a gentle squeeze. "You are being unkind to yourself." "Not unkind," Cecilia said. "Merely accurate." Their mother stood near the orchestra, posture rigid, eyes sharp as she surveyed the room. Her gaze slid over Cecilia without pause and fixed instead on Julia, lighting with anxious pride. Marianne followed the look and frowned. "I wish Mama would look at you the way she looks at Julia," she whispered. "It is not fair." Cecilia's smile thinned. "Life lost interest in fairness some years ago." She did not say when. Sometime after their father's sudden death, after accounts had become whispers and whispers had become worries. Cecilia had stepped into the empty spaces then, quietly, without ceremony. Someone had to keep the household steady while the younger girls were launched into society with borrowed jewels and forced optimism. Someone had to remain sensible. Sensible daughters did not cause trouble. Sensible daughters did not inspire poetry or scandal. They endured. A stir rippled through the ballroom, subtle at first, then unmistakable. Conversations faltered. Laughter thinned. The orchestra stumbled into an uncertain pause. At the top of the staircase, the footman straightened and struck his staff against the floor. His Grace, Adrian Blackwell, Duke of Ravensmore. The name passed through the room like a held breath finally released, soft, sharp, electric. Cecilia felt Marianne's fingers tighten on her arm. "It's him," Marianne breathed. "Why would he come here?" Cecilia turned despite herself. The Duke of Ravensmore descended the stairs with unhurried precision, dressed in stark black, the white of his cravat severe against it. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his movements economical, almost restrained. There was nothing flamboyant about him, no easy charm, no inviting smile. His features were sharply cut, his eyes pale and unreadable. And yet, people instinctively stepped aside, as if some unspoken law demanded it. They said he ruined men with conversations. That he never raised his voice, never wasted a word. That widows sought his favor and creditors feared his attention. That his house stood on a cliff above the sea, cold and joyless, and that no woman would willingly choose to live there. Men like that did not notice women like Cecilia Harrow. She told herself this firmly as her mother practically hurried across the room to greet him, curtsying with careful precision. Within moments he was swallowed by the crowd, mothers angling daughters, gentlemen offering introductions. Cecilia turned away. The talk of merciless dukes and ruined fortunes belonged to another world. Hers was smaller, quieter. She reminded herself to check that Marianne did not dance with Mr. Colic, whom she disliked. She reminded herself to ensure Julia did not forget to breathe during her first waltz. This was her realm. The orchestra struck up again. Marianne was claimed for a dance, leaving Cecilia alone once more. She exhaled, a mixture of relief and resignation. The night would pass like all the others. She would not dance. She would drift along the edges of other people's joy and go home unnoticed. Lady Cecilia Harrow. The voice was deep, calm, close. She turned. The Duke of Ravensmore stood before her. For one disorienting heartbeat, she assumed he must be addressing someone else. But his gaze, cool, direct, unsettling, was fixed on her face. Up close he seemed even more imposing, not because of his size but because of his stillness. He occupied his own space entirely, as if nothing around him could intrude unless he allowed it. "Your Grace," Cecilia managed, dipping into a curtsy. The silence spread outward in visible ripples. People were watching. "I am told," the Duke said, his voice carrying easily through the hush, "that this is an evening for choices." "So it is said," Cecilia replied, her throat inexplicably dry. He extended his hand, the gesture precise, deliberate. "Then allow me to make mine." For a heartbeat the world seemed to tilt. "She is my only choice." The whispers erupted instantly, sharp and incredulous. Cecilia stared at his outstretched hand, certain she had misunderstood. Of course he meant a dance. Nothing more. Men did not declare such things without calculation. "Your Grace," she said again, because someone had to behave as though sense still governed the room. The corner of his mouth twitched faintly. "Lady Cecilia, may I have this dance?" Her hand trembled as she placed it in his. His fingers closed around hers, not possessive, not hesitant. Simply certain. The crowd parted as they crossed the floor. Cecilia felt every gaze like a physical weight, her mother's stare burning with disbelief, Julia's smile frozen in confusion. She lifted her chin. If she must be spectacle, she would not shrink. The waltz began. The Duke led with practiced ease. His hand at her waist was steady, assured, unlike the awkward partners of her youth. They moved as though they had rehearsed, though they had never danced together before. "You seem troubled," he observed quietly. "I am unaccustomed," Cecilia replied, focusing on her steps, "to being the subject of dramatic declarations." "I prefer clarity," he said. "Then perhaps you might clarify what exactly you meant." His gaze met hers. Up close, she noticed faint shadows beneath his eyes, a weariness that did not soften him but deepened him. "I meant," he said, "that for my purposes this evening, you are the only choice that recommends itself." "For my purposes." The phrase bristled. "You speak as though I were an investment," Cecilia said coolly. "In some senses, everyone in this room is." "I dislike the term." "So do I," he said. Despite herself, a reluctant smile tugged at her lips. The music slowed. Applause followed. He released her hand only after the final note. "Do not stray far," he said, then turned away. Cecilia stood frozen as he approached her mother. She caught fragments of the conversation, words floating through the air like falling petals. "With your eldest, or not at all?" "A duchess," her mother whispered faintly. "I require a partner," the Duke said evenly. "Not an ornament." The world seemed unreal. In a withdrawing room moments later, Lady Harrow turned on Cecilia with barely restrained panic. "What did you say to him?" "Nothing," Cecilia replied honestly. "We danced. We spoke." Her mother pressed her fingers to her temples. "He could secure our future," she whispered. "All of us." "Would it be my future?" Cecilia asked quietly, "or yours?" Silence. Later that night, as Cecilia lay awake, the Duke's words echoed in her mind. Partner. Choice. Only choice. For the first time in years, someone had looked at her and seen not what she could provide but who she was. And that, more than the possibility of becoming a duchess, terrified her. Sleep refused to come easily after the ball. Cecilia lay awake long after the household had settled, staring at the faint pattern of moonlight on the ceiling, replaying the evening in fragments that refused to align into sense. The Duke's voice, calm, unembellished. His gaze steady, unsettling. The way the room had shifted around her as though she had stepped into a role written for someone else. By morning, the whispers had arrived before breakfast. Cecilia heard them first through the open window, carriages passing more slowly than necessary, voices pitched just loud enough to be overheard. By the time she entered the dining room, her mother was already seated, posture rigid, expression tight with anticipation. "You will receive a call today," Lady Harrow announced without preamble. Cecilia poured tea with deliberate care. "From whom?" "From His Grace," her mother said, as though the title alone should answer everything. "And if I do not wish to receive him?" Her mother's eyes flicked up sharply. "Do not be foolish." Cecilia set the teapot down. "I am trying very hard not to be." A knock came precisely at 11. Not early. Not late. The Duke of Ravensmore did not bring flowers. He was shown into the small sitting room, declining refreshment, declining comfort. He remained standing even after Cecilia entered, as if unwilling to claim space that was not yet his. "I appreciate your willingness to see me," he said. "I had little choice," Cecilia replied evenly. A faint inclination of his head. "I admire honesty." "Then you will admire this," she said, folding her hands together. "Your behavior last night was extraordinary. You have placed me in an impossible position." "Yes," he said. "I expected that." She studied him more closely now in daylight. There was nothing careless about him. Even his stillness felt intentional, as though movement itself were a resource to be spent wisely. "Why?" she asked. The question seemed to surprise him, not because he had not anticipated it, but because he had not expected her to ask so directly. "I require a wife," he said at last. "And you are suitable." Cecilia's mouth tightened. "That is not an answer. It is the most honest one I have." She exhaled slowly. "You might at least pretend sentiment." "I do not pretend," he said. "I select." "And what precisely did you select me for?" His gaze held hers. "You do not posture. You do not perform. You observe before you act. You have endured invisibility without bitterness." The words landed more heavily than flattery ever could have. "You do not know me," Cecilia said quietly. "I know enough," he replied. "And I will know more should you allow it." There it was, the space between command and request, narrow but deliberate. "You have not asked," she pointed out. "I am asking now," he said. "Will you consider becoming my wife?" "Consider. Not accept." Cecilia rose and crossed to the window, needing movement, distance. Outside, the street bustled with ordinary life, vendors calling, children darting past. How easily the world went on while her own threatened to shift entirely. "You understand," she said, "that I am not the woman society expected you to choose." "Yes." "You understand that I bring no fortune of significance." "Yes." "And that my presence at Ravensmore will provoke comment." "Yes." "Then why persist?" For the first time his composure cracked, not into emotion but something like weariness. "Because Ravensmore requires stability," he said. "And because there is a child." Cecilia turned sharply. "A child?" He nodded once. "She is not mine by blood. She is my responsibility." The room seemed to still. "Why have I not heard of her?" "You have," he said. "In fragments. Distorted." Cecilia's chest tightened. "People say many things about you." "They always have," he replied. "Few are accurate." He explained then, not in confession but in measured fact. The child, Eliza, had been left in his care years earlier by a distant relation. Her mother dead. Her father unknown. Ravensmore had become her refuge and her prison in equal measure. "She does not require a replacement mother," he said. "She requires consistency. Fairness. A presence that will not vanish." Cecilia listened in silence. "And you believe that presence is me?" "I believe," he said, "that you would not abandon her." The assumption unsettled her more than any romantic overture could have. You make it sound as though I am being recruited. In some ways, he admitted, you are. She laughed softly without humor. At least you are honest. I promised nothing else. When he left, he did so without expectation of an immediate answer. No pressure. No reminders. Only a single sentence at the door. Come to Ravensmoor, he said. See for yourself. Decide then. The journey north was quiet. Cecilia traveled alone, her mother too anxious to accompany her, her sisters too uncertain. As the carriage climbed higher ground, the landscape grew starker. Sea wind battered the windows. When Ravensmoor appeared at last, it was not the Gothic monstrosity of rumor, but it was formidable, stone set against cliff, solid and immovable, as if it had been placed there to endure rather than welcome. The Duke met her at the door. Inside, the house was cool, orderly, restrained. No excess. No warmth either. It felt paused, waiting. And then she saw the child. Eliza stood at the far end of the hall, dark-haired, solemn-eyed, watching Cecilia with unblinking intensity. She did not smile. She did not curtsy. This is Lady Cecilia, the Duke said evenly. She is a guest. Eliza tilted her head. Is she staying? I do not know yet, Cecilia said before the Duke could answer. The child studied her a moment longer, then nodded once as if cataloguing the response. Over the days that followed, Cecilia observed rather than intruded. She watched the Duke manage the household with quiet authority. Watched Eliza move through the rooms like a careful shadow. Slowly, cautiously, Cecilia began to speak, not to fill silence but to soften it. She read with Eliza in the afternoons. Walked with her along the cliff path. Never promised more than she could give. One evening, as the sun sank into the sea, Eliza asked, "Will you leave?" Cecilia considered the question carefully. "I might." Eliza nodded. "Most people do." That night, Cecilia stood alone in the great hall and understood the choice before her was no longer about title or security. It was about whether she would remain invisible, or finally step into something that required her fully. And she was not yet certain which frightened her more. Cecilia did not give her answer immediately. She returned to her mother's house changed in ways she could not yet name, carrying Ravensmoor with her like a weight and a promise in equal measure. London seemed louder after the cliffs and wind, its noise sharpened by comparison. Friends called. Distant relations sent notes heavy with curiosity disguised as concern. Invitations arrived that had not arrived in years. Her mother watched all of it with sharpened attention. "You will be a duchess," Lady Harrow said one afternoon, voice taut with triumph and unease. "Do you understand what that means?" Cecilia folded a letter and set it aside. "It means I will be seen. It means you will be secure." "That is not the same thing." Her mother hesitated. "You have spent your life being useful. This is your reward." Cecilia looked at her then, truly looked, and felt something loosen in her chest. "I do not want a reward," she said. "I want a life." The Duke did not press. Weeks passed without a word, and in the silence Cecilia realized the space he had given her was itself a form of respect. When he did write, the letter was brief. "I will abide by your decision whatever it may be." Nothing more. It was Eliza who decided her. Cecilia dreamed of her, standing alone in the great hall, small and unyielding, asking questions no one wished to answer. When she woke, the choice felt suddenly stark in its simplicity. She could return to a life where she was necessary but unseen, or she could step into one that required her fully, with all the risk that entailed. She wrote back the same day. "I will come to Ravensmoor. On my terms." The marriage was quiet. There were no grand celebrations, no flood of congratulation. Society responded with cautious fascination rather than approval. Some whispered she had been desperate. Others that she had been calculating. Cecilia allowed them their stories. She had lived too long under assumptions to fear them now. Ravensmoor received her without ceremony. The Duke, her husband now, did not offer false intimacy. On their first night he spoke plainly. "You are under no obligation to become what you are not," he said. "This house does not require performance." Cecilia appreciated that more than he knew. Days settled into rhythm. She learned the house slowly, deliberately. She did not sweep through rooms declaring change. Instead she listened, observed. Small adjustments followed. Light in darker spaces, meals taken together rather than alone, doors left open where they had once been closed. Eliza watched her with guarded curiosity. Cecilia did not ask for affection. She offered presence. They read together in the evenings, side by side rather than facing one another. Eliza spoke little at first, then more, then with surprising sharpness. Cecilia answered honestly, never condescending. Trust grew not from declaration but consistency. The Duke observed it all from a careful distance. He was not unkind. He was precise. He fulfilled his duties as husband with courtesy rather than warmth, as though afraid to intrude. Cecilia found herself both relieved and unsettled by this restraint. One evening, after Eliza had gone to bed, Cecilia spoke. "You need not remain apart," she said quietly. His gaze lifted, startled. "I am not apart." "You are," she replied. "By design." He did not deny it. "I have spent my life ensuring nothing is left to chance," he said. "Affection is unpredictable." "And yet," Cecilia said gently, "you entrusted me with the most vulnerable part of your life." He looked away. Seasons turned. Ravensmore softened, not in structure but in spirit. Laughter echoed in halls that had once held only footsteps. Staff began to linger. Flowers appeared on windowsills. Eliza smiled without effort. Cecilia found her place not as duchess but as anchor. Society came eventually, as it always did. Guests arrived with polite curiosity, expecting coldness and finding instead something quieter, steadier. The rumors shifted. The house was no longer cursed, merely private. It was during one such visit that the tension Cecilia had felt for months finally broke. She overheard a guest remark that she had been fortunate, that she had secured her future by chance. That night she confronted her husband. "I did not come here to be saved," she said, voice steady, "nor to be tolerated." His expression tightened. "I have never." "I need to know," she continued, "that you see me, not as solution or stability, but as choice." Silence stretched between them. "I did not believe," he said at last, "that you would wish to be chosen in that way. I would not have come otherwise." The truth settled slowly, heavily. He looked at her then, not with calculation but something more uncertain. "I chose you," he said quietly, "because you were the first person who did not want something from me." Cecilia stepped closer. "I wanted to be seen." He reached for her hand, not out of certainty but trust. Love did not arrive as revelation. It arrived as recognition. As winter gave way to spring, the space between them narrowed, not through passion but through understanding. Shared glances. Unspoken accord. A growing ease. One evening, standing at the cliff's edge, Cecilia realized she was no longer afraid of Ravensmore, or herself. Eliza joined her, slipping her small hand into Cecilia's. "Are you staying?" she asked. Cecilia smiled. "Yes." "For good?" "Yes." Later, as the wind rose and the sea churned below, the Duke spoke words he had never learned to say easily. "I am glad you chose us." Cecilia met his gaze, steady and unafraid. "So am I." And for the first time in her life she understood that being seen was not about spectacle or declaration, but about being known fully and choosing to remain.